World War I. Your objectives are: understand why the U.S. entered World War I, understand how the U.S. prepared for war, understand the propaganda used by the U.S., and describe warfare in World War I. What was life like for soldiers? At this time, Woodrow Wilson is president. He was a Democrat. Wilson is not interested in expanding American powers overseas. He is more focused on domestic concerns instead. In 1914, World War I breaks out in Europe. The trigger for World War I, prior to the U.S. getting involved, was the assassination of the Austria-Hungarian Empire leader Franz Ferdinand by a Serb. In response, Austria-Hungary moved in on Serbia, and both sides had secret alliances based on trade and other relations. For example, Russia came to the aid of Serbia. There are two sides to the war: the Allied powers, which were Russia, France, and Great Britain, and the Central Powers, which were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. At that time, U.S. remained neutral. The U.S. was considered an isolationist, meaning they didn't want to get involved in world affairs. While the war is going on, many U.S. German immigrants were advocating for the U.S. to get involved in the war. But Wilson did not want to do that. The feeling was America first, immigrant heritage second. So why did the U.S. enter World War I? Two of the reasons were because of the Germans' torpedoing of the Lusitania, and the other is because of the Zimmerman Note. I'll show you a copy of the Lusitania Note. During this time period, Germany had unrestricted submarine warfare. And part of that warfare was U-boats, and they were stealth. This was seen as unfair fighting. And in 1915, Germany torpedoed the Lusitania, which was a British luxury liner. 1,000 people died. 128 of those people were Americans. Germany had warned Americans not to travel on ships headed to the war zone. But America was angry. They said that the U.S. was neutral and that Germany should not have killed them. But the Germans said they bombed the Lusitania because there were ammunitions on board, which was not uncommon to have ammunitions on luxury liners, because that was one way that they could sneak across ammunitions in the war zone. There would be a continued series of attacks by German U-boats on both American and British ships. This endangered the lives of Americans, and it interfered with U.S. economic interest. The other reason was the Zimmerman Note. In 1917, Germany sent a telegram to Mexico, and it was intercepted by British intelligence. The telegram proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico. It states if Mexico will invade the U.S., Germany will give them back Texas and other former Mexican states, as well as additional compensation. One of the reasons that British intelligence intercepted this telegram and handed it over to the United States was because they wanted the U.S. to be in the war. So, on April 2nd, 1917, the U.S. will enter World War I. The U.S. will move from isolationism to foreign involvement. So how does the U.S. prepare for war? First of all, they have to mobilize for war. They will initiate a draft, and they will issue war bonds. So ultimately, Wilson needs to get support for the war. If you're going to send people's sons and husbands and grandfathers and such to war, then they need to really promote that to the American public so the country will get behind it. And one way they do that is through propaganda. I'm going to show you just a few of the ways that they sent out propaganda and try to promote the war. The first one is the "Gee, I wish I were a man" poster. This was a recruitment poster, and it wasn't trying to recruit women, it was trying to recruit men. There were women in the war, but they were not on the front lines and they didn't have major jobs. Oftentimes they were clerks and sometimes they were nurses. But this is using a woman, sex sells to promote recruitment, to get men to join up for the war. Another poster was this one. This is the torch of Lady Liberty. It shows Pershing, which was a part of the military, a military leader, rather, and it says buy a bond. So buy a war bond to help support the war. And the way war bonds worked was that Americans would buy a bond. Those bonds would bear interest, and then after the war, you would get that interest back. Another one. This one I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to talk about it for a few minutes. I will provide this link on Canvas. I actually will provide all of the links that I use in this lecture on Canvas. This is a propaganda film, and it's called The Bond, and it's by Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was a British comedic actor, but he was very popular in America. He often brought big crowds to the theater. So he will make this propaganda film encouraging Americans to buy war bonds. What I want you to pay particular attention to in this film is the message. What's depicted in this film. How does he try to get people to buy war bonds? Okay. And I'm not going to play this one either. Again, I will provide this link. but it's a song called Over There. It was a very popular song during World War I. So when you listen to this, again, I want you to pay particular attention to the message. Do you hear patriotic music? What names are mentioned? How are they encouraging Americans to support the war? Okay, life on the home front. So what's going on back home? While the war is going on, what's going on besides mobilization and preparing for war, what's going on at home? One of the things that's going on is conservation. During wartime, Americans are asked to conserve a number of different items, particularly crops, right? We need all of our efforts need to be focused on World War I was the thought process. We need to feed the troops. So we as a country had to ration, had to conserve these different items. Another example is the Foods from the Corn poster. It's kind of the same idea as conservation. It's saying to use corn because you can use corn in bulk and you can use it for everything, right? And so again, you need to conserve for the war effort. Something else that's going on the home front is this campaign called Fit to Fight. So the concern was that we have these young male soldiers going off to war. And oftentimes, before they went off to war, they would go into big cities like New York Cities and kind of have one last hurrah before they go off to war. Well, what was happening is you have young male soldiers going into cities. There are young prostitutes that these young men might frequent. This is supposed to be a prostitute, by the way, on the left on this poster. So the idea was to tell them not to do that, give them warnings of not to do that. One of the problems here is that venereal disease could occur, that these young male soldiers could attract venereal disease. And understand that this time there was not treatment for venereal disease. People died from venereal disease at this time. So it was to stay not only physically fit, but stay morally fit by not engaging in what was deemed as immoral activity. It says, go back to them physically fit and morally clean. There were also something called hostess houses. This is actually a picture of one in, I believe it's in Northern California. So what it was a place where young men going off to war could morally associate with young women. They would have parties at these homes, and they were supervised parties. Was often sponsored by the Young Women's, the YWCA. And oftentimes, uh, the men would mingle with these women, and they would provide food and and so forth. I'm not going to get into the specific battles or talk in depth about the battles. I just wanted to give you a sense of where the battles were. This was a one-front war. The, the stars here are some of the major battles of where the fighting took place. Warfare. World War I will bring new weapons. One of those weapons was biological warfare. The Germans had what they called mustard gas, and mustard gas could would could and did suffocate you if you breathed it in. So, because of that, soldiers had to wear gas masks, such as the one seen here. There was also another type of new warfare, which was called the Browning gun. You have to remember, the U.S. hadn't fought in a war since the Civil War, so the technology had drastically increased. During the Civil War, they were fighting with muskets and then rifles, but this is a much more powerful gun. It could shoot many bullets at one time at a rapid pace and could kill a lot more people quickly. Here is a book that was written about World War I by a former German soldier, and it was called All Quiet on the Western Front. And from this book, there was a couple of movies adapted, both called All Quiet on the Western Front, one in the 1930s and one in the 1970s. Simply just the horror of war. I also want you to notice the type of warfare that's going on here. You notice the guns, the Browning guns, also the fact that it was trench warfare, and also there was barbed wire. And what the barbed wire was used for was to basically herd your opponent into a certain area so you could kill them in large numbers. Okay. The next clip I have is from the 1970s version. And this has to do with biological warfare. And I want to point out that it wasn't just Germany that had mustard gas, but the U.S. had mustard gas and others had mustard gas as well. So the soldiers that you see in this film are German soldiers, the ones that are wearing the hats that have points on them.
Gas. The most feared, the most obscene weapon of all. We remember the awful sights in the hospital. The gas patients who, suffocating, cough up their burnt lungs in clots. Better to take your chances in the open rather than stay in the hollows and low places where the vapors settle. The new recruits give us more trouble than they are worth. Between 5 and 10 of them get killed to every old hand. And they get killed simply because they are so inexperienced. They know nothing, so they die like flies. No! 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 Hand me a rifle. God, wait! Baby. Just a baby.
Ends with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. President Wilson will advocate for a fair peace. He doesn't want to blame any one nation for the war. However, the Europeans disagree with him. They want to blame Germany, and they ultimately will. They will require Germany to pay millions in reparations and take land from them. Wilson tries to shape the European opinions, but to no avail. At the end of the war, and at the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson will provide his 14 points in a very famous speech. He will call for open diplomacy, freedom of navigation on the seas, removal of trade barriers, and arms reductions. But the most significant point is the 14th point, which is he calls for a League of Nations. The League of Nations would mediate disputes and supervise arms reductions. In other words, if you were a member of the League of Nations and another country tried to move in on your nation, the other members of the League of Nations would come to your aid. It's a precursor to the United Nations and to some degree NATO. The League of Nations will be adopted, but the U.S. will not be part of the League of Nations because the U.S. Congress did not want the U.S. to be part of the League of Nations. They had this concern that they didn't want to have to send their U.S. soldiers every time there was a dispute. So the U.S. will become isolationists again. So this concludes the lecture. If you have any questions, let me know.